Hey guys, tonight we begin with how Native American families survived winter travel across frozen land. Sounds, at first, like a story about enduring cold, but cold was only one part of the problem. A family moving through a northern winter had to move food, tools, bedding, children, and everything needed for the next camp across snow that could swallow a boot to the knee, forests that hid the horizon, and lakes that might become either highways or traps. There was no single Native American winter system. Different nations solved different landscapes in different ways. So tonight we're starting around Lake Superior, where Anishinaabe families developed a seasonal rhythm built around winter grounds, stored food, snowshoes, sleds, and routes known well enough to be used generation after generation. The surprising part is that winter did not simply shut travel down. Under the right conditions, it reorganized the map. If you enjoy slow, practical history like this, please like the video, subscribe, and comment with the place you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Near Lake Superior, the change began before the deepest cold arrived. National Park Service interpretation at Grand Portage describes Anishinabe's seasonal movement away from the lakeshore toward traditional wintering grounds and sometimes toward food caches. People could begin on foot or by canoe, then shift to snowshoes and sleds as snow and ice changed the ground beneath them. Winter travel was therefore not one long march into nowhere. It was movement through a landscape already understood in terms of food, shelter, waterways, hunting grounds, and stopping places. That distinction mattered. Imagine carrying a household through deep snow with no plan beyond go north. You would burn energy quickly and gain almost nothing. A winter route had to lead somewhere useful. The destination might offer game, firewood, protection from wind, or access to supplies prepared earlier. The route itself could follow familiar water systems because a frozen lake or river removed some of the brush, roots, rocks, and steep ground that slowed travel in warmer months. But frozen water brought its own judgment calls. Ice could open a path, yet only if conditions made it safe enough to trust. The most famous piece of equipment in this system was also one of the simplest to understand. A snowshoe makes your foot much larger without making your body much heavier. Instead of driving all your weight into the small area beneath a moccasin, the frame and webbing spread that load over more snow. Traditional Anishinaabe examples preserved by the National Museum of the American Indian use wood and hide, while Ojibwe language collections record not only the noun for snowshoe, but verbs for making them, putting them on, traveling in them, and even breaking their frames or webbing. That vocabulary is a small clue to how ordinary the technology was. A snowshoe was not an emergency gadget pulled out for a heroic expedition. It belonged to winter work. It had to be made, repaired, fitted, carried, and used well enough that walking in it became a normal skill. And walking was only half the problem. The family still had weight. For that, northern peoples used flat sleds or toboggans designed to slide over snow without wheels and without the tall runners of a European-style sleigh. In Anishinaabemowin, the Ojibwe People's Dictionary records Nabagidaban as a long sled without runners. Grand Portage interpretation notes that native people used such sleds, often with dogs, to move belongings over snow. It gives a useful scale. A pair of dogs could pull a load of roughly 200 to 500 pounds for 20 miles in about 5 hours. Even at the low end, 200 pounds changes the picture. That is not a backpack. It is blankets, tools, food, containers, hides, and pieces of a mobile household moving together. The sled reduced the need to lift that weight with every step. Snow became the surface carrying the load. This was especially important because a winter camp was not necessarily a tiny shelter for one hunter. At Grand Portage, NPS descriptions of historic Ojibwe winter lodges give dimensions of roughly 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet high, with larger structures capable of holding 3 or more generations of an extended family. Birch bark, already central to canoe construction, also covered these winter lodges. So when we say family travel, We should picture more than adults moving themselves from one hunting site to another. A winter move could be part of relocating the working centre of a household. The people, provisions, sleeping materials, tools, and knowledge of where to build or return all had to arrive together. One route makes that scale unusually easy to see. Grand Portage lies on the northwestern shore of Lake Superior. Out in the lake sits Isle Royale. For Ojibwe people, the water between them was not simply an empty blue gap. Families travelled between the mainland and the island for hunting, gathering, fishing, and later wage work. NPS records describe the route as ancient, with historic travel taking place by open water boat when conditions allowed, and over winter ice when the lake formed a usable bridge. The direct winter crossing could be about 14 miles. A dog team might cover it in roughly 3 to 4 hours. The arrangement described in the park record is wonderfully practical. One person went in front and made the trail, 3 to 5 dogs formed a team, and another person behind controlled the load. That turns an abstract phrase, like crossing a frozen lake, into a line of moving parts. First comes the person testing and opening the way. Behind comes the pulling power. Then comes the load, which has momentum of its own. At the rear is someone managing that momentum. If the sled begins to slide badly, if the dogs change direction, or if the trail becomes awkward, the group cannot behave like 5 separate travellers. It has to work as one system. The ice itself also had to be treated as a condition, not a promise. The same NPS account that describes historic crossings also records people who disappeared while attempting the route. Lake Superior could connect communities when it froze well, but a familiar route did not make ice harmless. That may be the first useful correction to the title. Survival did not come from treating winter as an enemy and overpowering it. It came from knowing when a frozen surface had become useful, carrying equipment shaped for that surface, and organizing people and animals so that energy was not wasted. Even the order of travel mattered. The person breaking trail paid a different physical cost from the person behind. Fresh snow resists. A packed trail does not resist as much. Once the first traveller compressed and opened a line, everyone following inherited a slightly easier road. And that brings us to a detail that modern winter travel can make easy to miss. Snow was not merely the thing slowing a family down. Properly understood, it could also become infrastructure. Snowshoes spread weight across it. A toboggan slid over it. Dogs could pull across it. A trail packed by the first traveller became easier for the next. Lakes that were barriers in one season could, under the right conditions, become broad winter corridors. The family did not survive because the frozen land stopped being dangerous. They survived because they learned how to make the frozen land carry them. And once the land was carrying the load, the next problem was keeping the people carrying themselves. Winter clothing sounds simple when we describe it from a warm room. Put on more layers, cover your hands, keep your feet warm. But a family walking for hours on snowshoes had a harder problem. The body was producing heat while the air was pulling heat away. Too little clothing could leave exposed skin and cold muscles. Too much, especially during hard travel, could make a person sweat. Once clothing became damp, stopping for the evening could turn that moisture into a serious problem. So winter dress had to work with movement. Among Ojibwe communities of the Great Lakes, hide remained an important material, while trade gradually added wool cloth, blankets, metal tools, and other imported goods. Museum collections preserve leggings, outer garments, and many forms of moccasins. They also preserve something more specific. Moccasins identified as being made for use with snowshoes. One Anishinaabe pair in the National Museum of the American Indian is made from moose hide, sewn with sinew, and tied with hide thong or babiche. That detail matters because a snowshoe does not replace footwear. It changes what footwear has to do. Your foot still needs to bend. The shoe has to sit inside a binding. The binding has to hold without turning every step into a fight against a stiff sole. Soft moccasins fit that system well. They were light, flexible, and repairable with materials people understood intimately. In Great Lakes collections, the familiar puckered construction gathered hide around the foot instead of building a heavy rigid shoe around it. But soft does not mean indestructible. Leather rubbed against snowshoe bindings, crusted snow, ice, wood, and frozen ground. It could wear. A torn seam or damaged sole was not a fashion problem when the next camp was hours away. It was a mobility problem. The practical answer was not to imagine one perfect pair lasting forever. Footwear belonged to the same maintenance world as sled lashings, snowshoe webbing, clothing seams, and lodge coverings. Things were used, checked, repaired, dried, and replaced. That makes the family's load look different again. Some of what was being hauled was not food or bedding. It was the ability to repair the things that made travel possible. There was also no reason to expose every part of the body to the same material. Leggings protected the legs, moccasins enclosed the feet, robes, hides, and later wool blankets could add insulation around the body. At Grand Portage and across the fur trade world, European newcomers eventually copied indigenous winter equipment because their own ordinary footwear and transport systems were poorly suited to deep snow. Minnesota Historical Society material on the fur trade makes the exchange quite plain. Traders adopted moccasins, toboggans, and snowshoes because those technologies worked. The direction of learning is worth noticing. The people already living there were not waiting for outsiders to explain winter. Outsiders arrived and learned that winter required a different set of objects. The same is true farther north, although the materials and traditions changed with the region. Innu knowledge recorded in a Canadian government study describes caribou as much more than meat. The animal could provide material for moccasins, clothing, mattresses, snowshoes, and other equipment. That meant one successful hunt could support both the calories that powered travel and some of the equipment needed to continue traveling. Nothing about that was effortless. Hide had to be removed and worked, sinew had to become sewing material, pieces had to be cut and joined in forms people had learned to make. A warm garment was therefore stored labor. So was a pair of moccasins. So was a repaired snowshoe. For children, the problem became even more basic. A small child could not simply be expected to walk the same distance as an adult breaking trail. Families needed ways to carry young children while protecting them from cold and keeping the adults mobile. Ojibwe collections preserve cradle boards and covers using deer or fawn skin, and descriptions note that cradles could be lined with tanned deer hide, animal skins such as fawn or rabbit, and moss. A cradle board did something very useful during movement. It turned a child into a secure load that could be carried while leaving the adult's body organized for walking and work. The exact materials and methods varied, but the larger principle is easy to see. Winter travel was designed around people who could not all contribute the same strength. That includes elders as well as children. A family was not a team of identical adults with identical stride lengths. Someone was stronger. Someone tired first. Someone carried a child. Someone handled dogs. Someone knew a route better. Someone might be repairing gear while others prepared food. The technology only worked because labor was divided around actual people. And all of those people had one enemy that is less dramatic than a blizzard and often more annoying: moisture. Snow sticks to clothing. Heat from the body melts it. Moccasins can become damp. A person working hard can sweat even in bitter cold. Then the group stops. The temperature does not stop with them. This is why drying was part of survival rather than housekeeping. A winter camp needed heat not only to cook and warm bodies, but to restore clothing and footwear for the next day. A wet item carried forward becomes heavier, colder, and less comfortable. A frozen item can become stiff. If the family had another long day ahead, yesterday's moisture had to be dealt with before morning. The work did not end when travel ended. Someone still had to establish shelter, manage the fire, prepare food, settle children, tend dogs where they were being used, inspect the sled, check lashings, and deal with clothing that had taken the day's punishment. The glamorous version of winter survival ends with everyone reaching camp. The real version begins another shift. That helps explain why winter clothing cannot be separated from shelter, fuel, and travel speed. A family that pushed too hard could arrive sweaty and exhausted. A family that stopped too often spent more time exposed and burned more food. A damaged moccasin could slow the whole group. A child who needed carrying changed the load. Every piece affected the next one. So the clothing was not simply armor against cold. It was part of a moving heat management system built around flexible footwear, repairable materials, layered protection, and the understanding that anything worn all day would eventually need attention at night. And before anyone could sleep, the family still had to solve the oldest winter question of all: where to put the fire, and how to make a temporary camp hold heat without burning through the fuel they had worked to reach. And before anyone could sleep, the family had to turn a patch of frozen ground into a place where people could stop losing heat. That sounds obvious, but it changes the entire meaning of winter travel. The destination for the day was not simply a point on a route. It had to become a working camp. Wood had to be available. The ground had to permit a shelter. The place needed enough protection to make the labor of stopping worthwhile. A bad campsite could force the family to spend more energy fixing the night than the day's travel had already consumed. For Ojibwe families in the Great Lakes region, bark-covered lodges were part of that solution. Minnesota Historical Society material describes Ojibwe wigwams as domed or oblong structures made from poles and covered with birch bark, hides, or other materials. Some could house more than one family. At Grand Portage today, the National Park Service interprets several forms of birch bark housing in its reconstructed Anishinaabe village, reminding us that there was not one single permanent shape used for every season and purpose. The advantage of a domed frame becomes easier to understand if you imagine building without a wagon full of lumber. You do not need milled boards. You do not need iron nails for every joint. Flexible poles create the skeleton. Bark or other coverings create the skin. The result is not a modern, insulated house, but it creates something the open forest cannot give you: a smaller pocket of air around the people inside. That smaller pocket matters. A fire in an open clearing sends heat in every direction. A fire inside a properly arranged lodge is working within an enclosure. Historical descriptions collected by the Wisconsin Historical Society record family wigwams roughly 8 to 12 feet across and 6 to 8 feet high. With an opening above for smoke, the dimensions varied, and written descriptions should never be mistaken for a universal blueprint. But the basic arrangement is clear: people, bedding, fire, and a smoke outlet occupied one compact space. Now picture arriving after dark. Snow has been squeaking under snowshoes for hours. The sled has bumped behind you. A child has fallen asleep against someone's back. Moccasins are damp. Fingers are clumsy. Everyone would like the fire first. But a fire does not begin as a fire. It begins as wood. That is one of the hidden costs of every winter camp. Fuel has to be found, gathered, broken or cut, carried and arranged. A large blaze may feel wonderful for a few minutes, but fuel burned quickly is fuel that cannot warm the camp later. The useful question is not, how big can we make the fire? It is, how much heat can we get from the work we can afford to do? This is where shelter and fire become one system rather than two separate technologies. The lodge reduces exposure, the fire supplies heat, bedding and clothing hold some of that heat close to the body. People sleeping near one another occupy a much smaller protected space than people scattered across an open clearing. None of this makes a Great Lakes winter comfortable by modern standards. It makes the night manageable. And it explains why arriving before complete exhaustion mattered. You still need hands that can work. One person can begin clearing and organizing the lodge site while another gathers fuel. Someone can unload bedding and food. Someone can deal with children. Someone can inspect footwear. If a bark covering or other shelter material is being carried, it has to be positioned. If the lodge is being reoccupied at a known winter ground, the work may be different again. Ojibwe economic life followed seasonal cycles and movement to customary places for hunting, fishing, gathering, and other work. So winter travel existed within a much larger geography of known resources, rather than as random movement across wilderness. Grand Portage itself preserves another beautiful example of this travel logic. Inside the park's Heritage Centre, a birch bark canoe is displayed overhead, in the way a canoe could be used as part of an overnight encampment shelter for Anishinaabe families travelling among the lakes and rivers of the Great Lakes region. The object that carried people across water could therefore help protect them after they stopped moving. One piece of equipment could do two jobs. That is exactly the kind of efficiency winter rewards. Every pound hauled across snow has a cost. Every object that can perform several tasks earns its place. A robe is clothing, but it can also become bedding. Transportation equipment may contribute to camp organization once movement stops. The point is not that every family used every object in exactly the same way. The point is that mobile life favors things that solve more than one problem. And then there is the snow itself. During the day, snow resists the traveler. Around a camp, however, terrain can help reduce exposure if the stopping place is chosen intelligently. A stand of trees, the shape of the land, or another natural break can matter because wind increases the rate at which exposed skin loses heat. Modern meteorology calls this wind chill, but people did not need a numerical index to experience the difference between an exposed shore and a protected patch of forest. So the smartest camp is not always the prettiest clearing. An open lake gives you a huge view of the sky. It also gives the wind room to run. A sheltered place among trees may provide less spectacle and more usable protection. That trade is very easy to understand at midnight. Once the shelter is standing and the fire is established, another round of work begins. Wet or damp footwear has to be dealt with. Clothing has to be dried because moisture increases heat loss in cold conditions. Food has to be prepared. Tools are put where they can be found in darkness. The next morning's departure begins, in a quiet way, before anyone lies down. This rhythm is why winter survival is misleading when we reduce it to dramatic moments. The spectacular moment is the crossing of a frozen lake. The survival moment may be someone checking a moccasin seam beside a low fire. The spectacular moment is a storm arriving. The survival moment may have happened hours earlier, when a family chose a protected campsite instead of continuing until everyone was exhausted. The spectacular moment is the temperature falling. The survival moment may be a bark lodge that makes the space around the body just small enough to protect. And there is another important thing happening inside that shelter. Knowledge is traveling too. Children see how the frame is made. They watch where bedding goes. They learn how the camp is organized, how equipment is protected, what has to be repaired, and what must be ready before morning. Skills that look extraordinary to an outsider can become ordinary when they are practiced repeatedly within a family and community. That may be the quietest technology in the entire journey. Not bark, not fire, not snowshoes. Memory. Because the safest winter camp was not created by a person suddenly becoming ingenious after the snow began to fall. It was created by people who already knew what had to happen before darkness arrived. And once the fire was burning, the next question was not whether the family was hungry. They almost certainly were. The real question was whether tonight's meal had been planned months earlier. Winter travel across the Great Lakes could not depend on finding fresh food every few miles. Snow-covered plants, ice changed access to water, game could move, storms could trap a group in place. A family that waited until evening to decide what to eat would be spending the most valuable thing it had, energy, at exactly the moment when energy was hardest to replace. So much of winter survival began before winter. For Anishinaabe communities, the year followed a seasonal cycle of fishing, hunting, gathering, gardening in some areas, harvesting wild rice, preserving food, and moving between places where particular resources could be found. By the time deep cold arrived, people were not beginning from zero. Dried foods, stored foods, and known locations could turn a winter journey from a daily gamble into something much more controlled. Drying did this beautifully. Fresh meat contains water. Water adds weight, and fresh meat does not remain usable forever without cold or preservation. Drying removes much of that moisture and produces food that is lighter, more concentrated, and easier to transport. Fish could also be dried or smoked. Corn, where it was grown and used, could be dried. Wild rice could be processed and stored. Berries could be dried for later use. A winter sled, therefore, carried more than food. It carried summer and autumn. A handful of dried food represented hours of earlier labor: harvesting, cleaning, cutting, smoking, drying, pounding, packing, protecting, and storing. By the time that food was eaten beside a winter fire, much of the work required to create the meal had already happened. That was exactly what a traveller needed. Imagine two choices at the end of a 12-mile day. In the first, you still have to search for dinner. You leave camp, travel farther, hunt, hope to find something, process it, bring it back, and only then begin cooking. In the second, you open a container of preserved food while someone else tends the fire and dries footwear. The second meal may sound less dramatic. It is also the one that leaves more strength for tomorrow. Food caches could extend that logic even farther. Instead of hauling every pound from the beginning of a journey, people could store supplies in known places and return to them later. A cache turns the landscape itself into part of the carrying system. The family does not need to drag every calorie across every mile if some of those calories are already waiting farther along the route. That makes memory practical. A bend in a shoreline, a stand of trees, a ridge, the mouth of a stream, or the relationship between several landmarks could become part of a mental map. We often imagine navigation as finding north. For people traveling a familiar homeland, navigation could be much richer than that. It meant knowing where food might be stored, where wood could be gathered, where ice was usually unreliable, where a portage began, where the land offered shelter, and how long the next stretch might take. In other words, the route contained instructions, and food shaped the speed of travel. A human body walking on snowshoes while carrying weight burns far more energy than a person sitting indoors. Add cold, trail breaking, hauling, camp construction, and the constant work of lifting feet over uneven snow, and the day becomes expensive. Every unnecessary detour costs food. Every badly packed sled costs food. Every hour spent fighting deep snow costs food. Calories were not only something eaten, they were a travel budget. Dogs, where dog teams were used, had their own budget. They could pull substantial loads, but pulling required feeding them. That meant dogs increased transport capacity while also increasing the amount of food the group had to support. A team was useful because the relationship could still be worthwhile. Animals could move loads that would otherwise have to be carried or dragged by people, but nothing moved for free. Then there was fresh food. Winter hunting remained important, and different communities pursued animals suited to their territories and traditions. Deer, moose, caribou farther north, smaller mammals, fish, and other resources could all matter depending on region. Hunting could replenish supplies and provide hides, sinew, fat, and other useful materials in addition to meat. But hunting was not a guaranteed grocery store. An animal had to be found. Snow conditions affected tracking and movement. Weather could reduce visibility. A successful kill created another problem. Now the meat had to be processed and moved. Cold could help preserve it, but weight did not disappear simply because the temperature dropped. This is where a sled became important again. The same flat surface that moved blankets and tools could bring meat back toward camp. Transport technology and food technology were connected. A successful hunt was only fully useful if the family could convert the animal into food and materials without exhausting itself in the process. Fat was especially valuable because fat is energy-dense. Lean meat can provide protein, but cold travel demands enormous amounts of energy. Many indigenous food traditions used animal fat in practical ways, including combining it with dried meat or other ingredients in preserved preparations. The exact foods varied widely between nations and regions, so it would be a mistake to turn one recipe into a universal Native American survival food. The broader principle is safer and more important. Dense food makes sense when every pound has to travel. A winter traveller wants calories that do not require hauling large amounts of water, bulky packaging, or fragile containers. That is one reason dried and preserved foods fit mobile life so well. And there was another advantage. They shortened the evening. When darkness comes early and temperatures fall, cooking time matters. A meal that can be warmed, boiled, or otherwise prepared without hours of work reduces fuel use and lets people turn attention to drying gear, repairing equipment, caring for children, and sleeping. Hunger is dangerous. Searching for food while already exhausted can be even more dangerous. So when we picture a family crossing a frozen lake with a sled behind them, we should not imagine that sled as a pile of random possessions. Every object has been competing for space and weight. Food earned its place because it was tomorrow's muscle. Dried meat was another mile. Stored rice was another hour of walking. A cache was a future camp already partly supplied. And the greatest achievement was not finding a miraculous meal in a frozen wilderness. It was arranging the year so that winter did not have to provide everything on the day it was needed. And once food, shelter, and clothing were organized, there was still one thing no sled could carry for a family: judgment. A winter route could be known for generations and still change overnight. Snow drifted into hollows, wind polished one patch of ice and buried another. A river that had been safe days earlier could open near moving water. A lake could look flat, white, and solid while hiding weaker places beneath the snow. The landscape was familiar, but familiarity did not make it fixed. So winter travel depended on reading conditions as they existed that day. That kind of reading begins with small things. Snow has texture. Fresh powder behaves differently from wind-packed snow. A crust can support a person for a few steps and then break. Deep, soft snow forces the traveller to lift each snowshoe higher. Hard-packed trails allow faster movement. Wind can expose old tracks in one place and erase them completely in another. For a family, those differences were not scenery. They were speed. If the snow became deeper, the person breaking trail had to work harder. If the crust caught the front of a snowshoe, every step became more awkward. If wind filled yesterday's path, the group might have to make it again. A journey that took 4 hours in good conditions could demand much longer after a storm. That meant departure time mattered. Leaving early gave the family more daylight to absorb delays. It also gave people time to stop before exhaustion made ordinary decisions worse. A late start could push the last miles into darkness, when landmarks became harder to distinguish and camp work became more difficult. The safest schedule was not necessarily the fastest one. It was the one that left room for winter to interfere. Ice required even more caution, because it could create the easiest road and the most serious hazard at the same time. A frozen lake removes hills, brush, fallen trees, and many of the obstacles found on shore. A sled can glide across a level surface. Dogs can pull efficiently. A family can sometimes travel directly between places that require a much longer route in summer. But ice is not a wooden floor. Water moves beneath it. Currents, springs, river mouths, narrows, pressure cracks, changing temperatures and snow cover can all affect how ice forms. Even where a route was known, travellers had to pay attention to the surface rather than assuming that winter had made every section equally safe. And snow could hide the evidence. A clean sheet of bare ice lets you see more of the surface. A layer of snow makes travel easier in some ways, giving snowshoes and sleds a different surface to work on, but it can also cover cracks, rough ice, or changes in texture. So people watched. They listened. They compared what they saw with what they already knew about the place. The knowledge was local because the danger was local. A family who knew one lake intimately might know where currents usually ran, where the shoreline stayed protected, where wind swept snow away, or where a stream entered beneath the ice. Those details could matter more than any general rule about how winter usually behaved. The same was true on land. A ridge can help orientation, but it can also expose travellers to wind. A low forested area may offer shelter, but collect deeper snow. A river valley may provide a natural corridor, yet steep banks or overflow can complicate movement. The best route was therefore rarely just the straightest line. It was a compromise between distance, snow, wind, shelter, fuel, food, and what the group could actually manage. That last part matters. A route suitable for two experienced hunters traveling light is not automatically a good route for a family moving children, bedding, tools, food, and a loaded sled. The slowest problem controls the group. If a child becomes cold, everyone stops. If a binding breaks, everyone waits. If a sled overturns, the miles already covered do not help with the minutes now being lost. This is why equipment checks were not separate from navigation. A family could choose the perfect route and still fail to make progress if a snowshoe lashing came loose repeatedly. Travel decisions included the condition of the people and the gear, not only the condition of the land. Weather added another layer. Long before numerical forecasts, people could observe changes directly. Wind direction, clouds, temperature shifts, snowfall, and the behavior of the landscape offered information. No observation could guarantee exactly what would happen next, and severe weather could still surprise travelers. But a person who spent winter after winter in the same region did not encounter every change as a completely new event. Patterns accumulated. Someone remembered what a certain wind had done before. Someone knew which side of a lake became difficult in drifting snow. Someone recognized that continuing for another hour would leave no good shelter nearby. This kind of knowledge is difficult to display in a museum case because it is not an object. You cannot hang it beside a snowshoe, but without it, the snowshoe is only wood and webbing. A traveller has to know where to point it. Children learned this slowly. They travelled behind adults. They watched which routes were chosen and which were avoided. They heard place names connected to stories, hazards, resources, and previous journeys. They learned that a frozen surface was not simply safe or unsafe. It had to be judged in context. And they learned something else modern travellers often forget. Turning back is also a travel skill. There is no prize for reaching the far shore if the conditions have become wrong. A family could stop, delay, change route, or make camp earlier than planned. These decisions might feel like lost progress, but survival depends on understanding that distance is not the only thing being spent. Daylight is being spent. Body heat is being spent. Food is being spent. The strength of the dogs, where they were used, is being spent. And attention is being spent too. The longer people travel in difficult conditions, the more fatigue can turn a small mistake into a larger one. So the landscape was constantly asking a quiet question. Is continuing still worth the cost? Some days, the answer was yes. The trail was firm, the wind was manageable, the ice was trusted, the family moved quickly, and miles disappeared beneath the sled. Other days, winter changed the price. Then survival meant noticing before the price became too high. That may be one of the hardest parts of this history to see, because good judgment leaves very little evidence behind. A broken sled can enter the archaeological record. A pair of snowshoes can survive in a museum. A lodge can be reconstructed. But the decision to stop 2 miles early because the wind had shifted leaves almost nothing about. And yet that decision may have saved everyone in the camp. Winter travel was therefore not only a story of strong bodies and clever equipment. It was a story of knowing when the land had changed its mind. And once the family knew where to go, the next challenge was making sure everyone arrived together. That sounds simple until you imagine the group itself. Not everyone was the same age. Not everyone carried the same weight. Someone might be breaking trail. Someone might be handling dogs. Someone might be carrying a very young child. Someone might be tired from the previous day. An elder might know the route better than anyone else, while moving more slowly than a younger traveller. Winter travel, therefore, could not be organised around the strongest person simply walking as fast as possible. It had to be organised around the family, Among Ojibwe communities around Lake Superior, seasonal movement was part of a much larger cycle. Families shifted between customary places as the year changed, including inland winter hunting camps. Grand Portage, or Gichi Onigamiing, was one point inside that geography. An historical interpretation describes winter camps at inland locations such as Brule, Whitefish, and Arrow Lakes. This matters because a family moving toward a winter camp was not an expedition assembled from strangers. The travelers already knew one another. They knew who could carry what. They knew who was good with a sled. They knew which child would need help after several miles. They knew whose knowledge mattered when the route became uncertain. That familiarity made labour flexible. Imagine the first person in deep snow. Every step presses down untouched snow. The snowshoe spreads body weight, but the traveller still has to lift the frame, push forward, and create a usable line. The second person gets a slightly easier surface, the third easier still. When dogs and a loaded toboggan follow, the difference between untouched snow and a broken trail becomes even more important. Grand Portage National Monument still presents the snowshoe and the runnerless toboggan together as central pieces of Ojibwe winter travel technology. Museum collections likewise preserve Anishinaabe snowshoes and moccasins, specifically associated with snowshoe use. But equipment does not decide who goes first. People do. The person breaking trail does not have to stay there forever. If one traveller takes the hardest position until exhaustion, the group may gain speed for an hour and lose it for the rest of the day. A more sensible rhythm is to treat effort as something that can be distributed. When conditions allow, stronger walkers can take demanding positions, then others can assume different tasks as fatigue builds. We should be careful here. Historical records rarely give us a minute-by-minute instruction manual for every Ojibwe family journey, and practices differed by community, era, route, and circumstance. But the basic physical problem is unavoidable. Someone must do the harder work first. Someone must manage the load behind, and the group must keep enough strength in reserve to build camp at the end. Now add children. A child old enough to walk might cover part of the route and still be unable to match an adult for an entire day. A baby obviously cannot travel independently at all. Indigenous cradle technologies solved part of this problem by securing young children to a portable support that could be carried while adults remained mobile. The important point is not that every child spent every winter journey in exactly the same kind of cradle. It is that family travel included people who could not power their own movement. Their weight had to enter the transportation system. A child carried on an adult's body increases that adult's energy cost. A child placed securely with transported gear changes the sled load. Either way, the group has to account for that person. This is what makes the word family so important in our title. A lone hunter can make decisions around one body. A family cannot. The same principle applies to elders, though age alone tells us very little about what someone could do. An older person might move more slowly while holding the best memory of the route, the location of a winter camp, the behaviour of a particular stretch of ice, or the way weather usually changed around a certain landmark. Strength and knowledge are not the same resource. A younger traveller can break trail. An older traveller can prevent the entire group from breaking the wrong trail. And then there were the loads themselves. A runnerless toboggan, the kind recorded in Ojibwe vocabulary and represented in Great Lakes winter interpretation, kept weight low against the snow rather than balancing it high above narrow runners. This made it suited to moving gear through snowy country. Snowshoes, toboggans, and moccasins were so effective in this environment that European fur traders adopted indigenous technologies rather than relying only on the equipment they had brought with them. But a sled is useful only while its load behaves. Put too much weight on one side and it can pull awkwardly. Stack something badly and it can shift. Place an item needed during the day underneath everything else, and the entire load may have to be disturbed just to retrieve it. So packing is part of movement. The things needed at the evening camp might be arranged differently from things needed only at the winter destination. Food for the day needs to remain reachable. Repair materials may need to come out quickly. Bedding should stay protected from snow and moisture. Every stop has a cost. Take off a binding, open the load, find the missing item, re-tee everything, put the snowshoe back on. Now multiply that by a whole family in cold weather. Organization saves heat. This also explains why a group might not spread itself across a huge distance on the trail. If people remain within useful reach of one another, a damaged binding, overturned sled, tired child, or uncertain patch of ice becomes a shared problem quickly. If the strongest walker disappears far ahead, that strength is no longer helping the people behind. Winter rewards cooperation more than dramatic individual speed. And dogs, when used, became another part of that cooperation. They added pulling power, but they were living members of the transport system. They needed food, control, rest, and a route they could physically follow. Grand Portage interpretation preserves the image of Ojibwe winter travel with people, snowshoes, sled dogs, and a toboggan as parts of one connected scene rather than isolated tools. So picture the group again. A person in front presses a path into fresh snow. Behind, other travelers follow the line. A dog team pulls a low sled. Someone watches the load. A child rides because the distance is too great. Another child walks for a while, then tires. A person who knows the country watches the shoreline, trees, wind, and shape of the route. No single person is doing everything. That is the system. And when the group stops, roles change again. The trail breaker may no longer be the person gathering wood. The person who watched the children may begin preparing food. Someone checks the sled. Someone dries footwear. Someone makes sure tomorrow's equipment is not buried under tonight's bedding. The family survives the journey not because every member is equally strong, but because unequal strengths can be combined. That may be the deepest advantage of moving as a family. Winter creates dozens of small problems. A group gives those problems more than one pair of hands. And on frozen land, sometimes the difference between a difficult day and a disastrous one was simply that nobody had to solve the next problem alone. That mattered most after the walking stopped, because nighttime gathered several of those problems into the same few hours. For a Mille-Lac Ojibwe elder named Nodinans, whose childhood memories reach back to the late 1850s or early 1860s, a winter camp was not an abstract survival lesson. She remembered 6 families traveling together into the deep woods and building 6 wigwams in a circle. Snow was shoveled away, the lodges were banked with evergreen boughs and snow. Inside, cedar boughs covered the ground, and blankets went over them for beds. The number matters too. 6 families in one winter camp means the social unit could be larger than the single isolated household we often picture. Each lodge had its own interior work, but nearby relatives or companions meant labour, information, and help were close at hand. A broken tool, an illness, a difficult hunt, or a sudden change in weather did not necessarily leave one household completely on its own. The winter camp could be mobile without being lonely. That one memory gives us a much clearer picture of what sleeping outside actually meant. You did not simply lie down on frozen earth and hope your blanket was thick enough. The family changed the surface beneath the body. Cedar boughs created separation from the cold ground and made the sleeping area more usable. Blankets went above them. Bags could serve as pillows. The lodge became a small working room with different zones rather than a pile of people around a flame. Nodinens remembered a fireplace in the centre. Between that fire and the sleeping mats was a strip of hard, dry ground kept clean with a broom made from cedar boughs. That is an ordinary domestic detail, which is exactly why it matters. A winter lodge still had housekeeping. People still needed a place to move, work, sit, reach the fire, and avoid dragging snow and debris into bedding. The camp outside was organised too. Near the door stood a small cedar bark shed for split firewood. The reason was practical: keep the wood from getting wet and keep it close enough to reach easily during the night. Nodinans also remembered that there could be several such sheds around a lodge. Men brought the logs, while women chopped the wood and stacked it ready for use. So before anyone went to sleep, tomorrow's warmth had already been divided into pieces. A pile of unsplit logs is potential heat. Split wood beside the door is usable heat. That difference becomes very important when someone wakes in darkness and the fire has fallen low. The point is not to begin searching for fuel after the lodge is already cold. The fuel has been gathered, processed, sheltered, and placed where a sleepy person can get it, without rebuilding the evening's entire work. That practical interpretation follows directly from Nodinance's description of keeping split wood dry and easy to reach at night. This also changes how we should imagine the fire. It was not necessarily a roaring wall of flame maintained for spectacle. A central fire had to share limited space with people, bedding, clothing, tools, and lodge coverings. Fuel took labor to collect. The useful fire was the one that could keep serving the lodge without consuming the family's energy faster than it returned warmth. Nodinan's account places the fire at the center of an organized living space, rather than treating it as a separate camp feature. And sleep itself was part of the travel system. A person who sleeps badly does not wake with the same body. Feet feel heavier. Small repairs seem more annoying. Attention drops. That matters on a route where attention is being used to read snow, manage a sled, follow landmarks, watch children, and judge ice. Rest was therefore not time taken away from travel. Rest made the next day of travel possible. The design of Ojibwe dwellings reflected season and purpose. A historical description preserved by the Ojibwe People's Dictionary notes that domed and peaked wigwams were used in winter, while other forms were associated with warmer seasons. It also describes coverings that could be carried while more permanent frameworks remained at established sites. That creates another useful possibility for seasonal movement. Not every journey had to begin with building every part of a home from nothing. A family returning to a known place might be returning to more than a location. They might be returning to part of a structure, or simply to a place whose resources, routes, and problems were already familiar. The surviving historical description specifically notes that some frameworks remained, while coverings could travel with the family. That is a very different kind of travel from wandering. Then there were temporary stops, when the goal was not to establish a full winter camp at all. At Grand Portage National Monument, a birch bark canoe is displayed in the Heritage Centre, in a position showing how such a canoe could be used as part of an overnight encampment shelter during Anishinaabe travel among Great Lakes waterways. Again, the important idea is economy. The canoe had already earned its place by carrying people and cargo on water. If it could also help shape an overnight shelter, it did not become useless the moment the paddling stopped. Mobile equipment was most valuable when it could keep working after the day's main task had ended. Night also gave the family a chance to reverse the damage of the day. Snow had worked into bindings, clothing might be damp, a moccasin seam might be starting to open, a sled lashing could have stretched, food for the next day needed to be reachable. Anything left disorganized at night became a problem waiting in the morning. And winter mornings were already busy enough. The fire had to be brought back up, food had to be prepared, bedding had to be gathered, children had to be made ready, equipment had to come out of the lodge or camp without disappearing into loose snow, snowshoe bindings had to sit correctly before the first difficult mile, not after it. A well-run evening therefore bought time at dawn. That may be one reason Nodinan's memory of split wood beside the door is so powerful. It is not dramatic. Nobody is lost. Nobody is freezing. No storm is tearing the camp apart. Someone simply made sure the wood would be dry and easy to reach at night. That is what successful winter travel often looked like from the inside. Not a constant emergency. A series of emergencies prevented early enough that they remained chores. By morning, the family could step back into the snow with warm food inside them, equipment checked, bedding packed, and another trail waiting ahead. But as those miles accumulated, another problem grew quietly beneath every step. Even the best equipment wore out, and winter survival depended just as much on knowing how to repair a journey as knowing how to begin one. Because nothing in that system was disposable, a winter journey depended on objects that bent, stretched, rubbed, froze, dried, and wore down. Snowshoe webbing took the pressure of every step. Bindings worked against the foot. Moccasins flexed thousands of times. A sled dragged its load over crust, powder, ice, roots, and whatever else the trail exposed. If one of those things failed, the family did not have a store around the corner. They had hands, materials, and knowledge. The Ojibwe People's Dictionary gives us an unusually small but revealing window into this world. It records one verb for breaking the frame of a snowshoe and another for breaking its webbing. It also records verbs for making snowshoes, putting them on, taking them off, carrying them along, and travelling in them. That vocabulary does not give us a field repair manual, but it tells us something important. A snowshoe was understood as a working object with parts that could fail in different ways. And those failures were not equal. If a strand of webbing broke, the wooden frame could still be sound. If the frame itself cracked, the whole shape of the shoe could be compromised. Either problem mattered because the snowshoe worked by spreading weight over a broad surface. Lose too much of that surface, and the traveller begins sinking deeper. The basic construction helps explain the risk. The Hudson Museum describes long, narrow, Ojibwe-style snowshoes made from 2 wooden staves secured at the tip and tail. It also notes that northeastern snowshoes used babiche work and that protective cloth, yarn, or moose hair could reduce chafing along important cords. Different snow conditions could call for different shoe forms or lacing arrangements. So wear was not an abstract possibility. People were already designing around it. A cord that rubs every time you walk will eventually weaken. A binding that sits badly can make every mile harder. Rawhide and wood react to moisture. Snow catches on edges. A shoe that worked perfectly at the start of winter could need attention after repeated use. This is why maintenance belongs inside the story of travel. You do not wait for the entire snowshoe to collapse if you can see a small problem beginning. A loose section can be noticed. A worn connection can be watched. A damaged piece can be dealt with while the family still has daylight, shelter, and working hands. The exact repair would depend on what broke and what materials were available. We should not pretend every family carried the same standardized repair kit, but the materials preserved in museum collections show why repair was possible in principle. A pair of Anishinaabe moccasins made specifically for snowshoe use, now held by the National Museum of the American Indian, is made from moose hide, sinew, and hide thong or babiche, all sewn together rather than molded into a rigid modern shoe. Sewn things can be opened. They can also be sewn again. That did not make repair effortless. Cold fingers are poor tools. Hide can be stiff. A tear in the wrong place can grow. But a moccasin was not a sealed factory product that became useless the moment one seam failed. It belonged to a material system people knew how to work. The same was true of snowshoes. A Grand Portage, National Park Service interpretation identifies a Ajimaj, snowshoes, and Nabagidaban, the flat toboggan, as technologies from northern snow country. The park also notes that fur trade Northmen depended on snowshoes made by native women in the villages around trading posts. That detail shifts the picture again. Snowshoe making was not only a household skill hidden inside one family's winter camp, it could become part of a larger regional economy because newcomers also needed the technology. By the fur trade period, Grand Portage records show guns, brass kettles, axe heads, blankets, cloth, beads, fire steels, and flints moving through exchange. Deep snow still forced newcomers to learn from people who already knew how to move through it. And dependence on indigenous snowshoes meant dependence on indigenous manufacturing knowledge too. Think about what a maker had to control. The frame needed the right shape. The crosspieces needed to hold. The webbing had to support weight without turning the whole object into a heavy wooden board. The foot needed an opening and a binding arrangement that allowed the shoe to move as the wearer stepped. The final object had to be light enough to lift thousands of times and strong enough to carry a person across deep snow. A bad snowshoe announces itself one step at a time. Too heavy, and your legs pay. Too weak, and the frame pays. Too little support, and you sink. That same logic applied to the toboggan. Grand Portage describes the Anishinaabe-Moin name as combining the idea of flatness with a sled, and notes that native people used these runnerless sleds, often with dogs, to move belongings over snow. A flat sled has fewer delicate raised runners to manage, but it still has connections, crosspieces, lashings, and a load that must stay together. If a tie loosens, the cargo shifts. If the load shifts, the sled pulls differently. If something falls off unnoticed, the family may discover the loss miles later. So stopping to tighten a lashing is not lost time. It is cheaper than walking backward. The same principle reaches all the way down to clothing. A tiny opening in a moccasin seam lets in snow. Snow melts against warmth. Now the problem is no longer just a seam. It is moisture around the foot. A repair that takes a few minutes beside the evening fire may prevent hours of discomfort the next day. In winter, maintenance often works by stopping one category of problem from becoming another. Mechanical failure becomes wet clothing. Wet clothing becomes lost heat. Lost heat becomes fatigue. Fatigue makes travel slower. Slower travel consumes more daylight and more food. One loose stitch can travel surprisingly far through the system. That is why a winter camp was also a workshop. The day's equipment could be spread out where damage was visible. Snowshoe webbing could be examined, bindings could be checked, moccasins could be dried and looked over, sled lashings could be tightened. Items needed in the morning could be put where they would not have to be found under snow or bedding. None of this looks heroic. That is precisely the point. A family that repaired equipment early did not need heroics later. And children growing up around that routine were learning something more valuable than the name of each object. They were learning when an object was beginning to fail. That judgment takes repetition. You learn the sound of a loose piece. You notice when a binding feels different. You see wear before it becomes a hole. You understand that putting something away wet means meeting the same problem again in worse condition. This is how material knowledge survives a journey. Not because nothing breaks, because breaking is expected. And once a family could keep its snowshoes, clothing, and sled moving through repeated days of use, another question became possible. How far could those days actually take them? Because some winter routes were not simply trips from camp to camp. They connected communities across distances that look almost impossible when the land is buried in snow. And that brings us to distance. A winter journey did not have to end at the next camp. In a region filled with lakes, rivers, islands, forests, and narrow land crossings, one successful day could connect to another, and then another, until a family had moved through a whole network of places that were already known. That is one of the easiest things to misunderstand about northern winter travel. To an outsider looking at a map, frozen country can look empty. To the people who lived there, it was crossed by routes. The Minnesota Historical Society notes that Dakota and Ojibwe travelers followed trails through prairies and woodlands, including animal paths leading toward water. In winter, snowshoes became part of that movement, while heavier loads could be pulled over land and ice on sleds and toboggans. Europeans later adopted many of these travel techniques and followed routes indigenous people had already established. So winter did not erase the road system. In some places, it changed the material the road was made from. A river in summer may twist between banks, force travelers around rapids, or require a canoe. A lake may demand paddling and expose travelers to waves, Once solid winter conditions arrived, parts of those same waterways could become broad travel corridors. A family could move across surfaces that, during warmer months, required a completely different technology. The most dramatic example in our story is still Minong, or Isle Royale. The National Park Service identifies Minong as part of the ancestral lands of Anishinaabe and Ojibwe peoples. Grand Portage lies on the nearest Minnesota mainland, and the two places were connected long before modern ferries or park boundaries existed. A National Park Service account describes a historic route between Grand Portage and Isle Royale that was used for centuries over either open water or ice. People travelled it by boat when the lake was open, and by foot or dog sled when winter created a usable ice bridge. The direct ice journey could cover roughly 14 miles. 14 miles sounds small on a highway. It is not small when there is no highway. Stand on the edge of Lake Superior in winter and imagine the opposite shore not as a road sign, but as a line somewhere beyond a white horizon. There is no painted lane, no gas station, no heated vehicle. Everything needed for the crossing is either on your body, on the sled, with the dogs, or already waiting at the destination. And yet the route was not a leap into the unknown. That distinction is everything. A known winter route might connect relatives, hunting areas, fishing places, camps, stored supplies, and other parts of a familiar homeland. NPS research on Minong emphasizes the long relationship between the Grand Portage Ojibwe and the island, while Grand Portage families also maintained close kin relationships extending north and west around the international border region. So a journey could have a social destination as well as a physical one. You are not merely crossing ice. You are going to someone, or returning somewhere, or moving toward work that had already been planned. That gives winter travel a completely different emotional shape from the popular image of survival. The landscape was dangerous, yes, but it was also populated with memory. One point led to the next. A shoreline told you where you were. An island changed the angle of the route. A portage connected one body of water to another. A known camp reduced uncertainty at the end of the day, and the farther the network extended, the more important local knowledge became. Modern maps encourage us to think in straight lines, put 2 points on a screen, draw the shortest route, and follow it. Winter travellers had more variables. The shortest line across a lake might cross bad ice. The fastest land route might climb into exposed wind. A longer shoreline route might offer shelter, wood, or easier access to camp. A familiar portage might save time because people already knew exactly where to leave the water and where the next route began. Distance on a map was therefore not the same as cost on the ground. 10 easy miles could be cheaper than 5 terrible ones. And once that principle is understood, Indigenous transportation technology begins to look less like a collection of clever objects and more like an entire mobility system. Moccasins let the foot remain flexible. Snowshoes spread the traveller over deep snow. Toboggans moved loads across that snow. Dogs could add pulling power in communities and situations where they were used. Birch bark canoes served open water travel. Trails and portages connected waterways across land. The season changed. The combination changed with it. That adaptability was powerful enough that fur traders arriving in the region adopted indigenous moccasins, snowshoes, and toboggans for winter travel. The Minnesota Historical Society specifically notes that traders adopted these technologies to handle winter conditions. They had little choice. A European boot did not flatten deep snow. A wheeled cart did not suddenly become useful because the temperature dropped below freezing. Winter rewarded the equipment that matched winter. But there is another layer to these routes that maps still cannot show. Nose. A named place is easier to remember than an anonymous patch of forest. A place connected to a story is easier to teach. A lake associated with relatives, food, danger, or previous travel carries information inside the way people speak about it. The Ojibwe People's Dictionary today preserves not only vocabulary, but recorded Ojibwe voices, photographs, cultural objects, and historical materials, offering a modern window into how language and cultural knowledge remain connected. For a child traveling behind adults, the map was being learned one journey at a time. This is where we cross. This is where the current is stronger. This is where we leave the lake. This is where the trail climbs. This is where we can find wood. This is where our relatives live. No single winter journey teaches the entire landscape. Repetition does. A child sees the same ridge from a different angle the next year. A young traveller eventually takes a position nearer the front. Someone who once followed a trail begins helping choose it. The network remains useful because knowledge moves through generations along with the people using it. And this helps explain why later colonial borders could divide political territory without erasing older relationships. NPS research notes that Grand Portage Band members have close kin at Fort William First Nation near Thunder Bay and among Ojibwe communities further west. Relationships complicated by the eventual establishment of the United States-Canada boundary. A political line could be drawn on a map. Kinship had already crossed it. Winter roots had already crossed it. Memory had already crossed it. So when we imagine a native family moving over frozen land, we should make the picture bigger than one dangerous lake. Behind them are routes already travelled. Ahead are places already known. Beside them are people carrying pieces of the same map in memory. And beneath their snowshoes is not empty wilderness. It is a road that only appears when winter arrives. And some of those roads ended where the animals had gone. That was one reason winter camps were placed inland in the first place. Around Grand Portage, Ojibwe families left the summer village and spent the cold season in hunting camps at places such as Brule, Whitefish, and Arrow Lakes. Minnesota Historical Society material describes the broader pattern the same way. In winter, bands often divided into smaller family groups living in sheltered woods, while hunting and fishing remained part of the seasonal economy. A smaller camp changed the math. A large village needs a great deal of food close at hand. A smaller household can move nearer to the places where animals are likely to be found, use local firewood, and shift its daily work around the conditions of that particular winter ground. The point was not to scatter because people had stopped being connected. It was to place fewer mouths around resources that were more thinly spread during the coldest part of the year. And snow, difficult as it was to walk through, could also reveal movement. An animal crossing fresh snow leaves evidence behind. Hoof prints, paw marks, disturbed crust, and a line through brush can turn an otherwise hidden animal into a direction. National Park Service interpretation at Grand Portage even encourages winter visitors to look for animal tracks in the snow while describing species such as fox, deer, wolves, martins, and other animals that share the northern forest. For an experienced hunter, a track was not the animal itself. It was information with an expiration date. Snow could fall over it. Wind could soften the edges. Other animals could cross it. A trail might show that game had passed through without telling you whether it was still close enough to justify following. The useful skill was not simply recognizing a print. It was deciding whether that print was worth spending daylight and energy on. That decision mattered because hunting could become expensive very quickly. Leave camp for an hour and return empty-handed, and the loss is manageable. Follow a trail half a day in the wrong direction, and the family has spent food, daylight, and strength without adding anything to the sled. A hunter therefore had to think like a traveller even while hunting. How far from camp are we? How much light remains? What is the snow doing? Will the return route be harder after dark? If an animal is taken, how will its weight come back? The last question is easy to forget. Finding an animal does not make it weightless. A successful hunt creates immediate work. Meat has to be handled. Useful hide and other materials may need to be saved. The result has to reach camp. A toboggan that had carried household goods on the journey could now become part of the return from the hunt. Because the same low sliding surface that made a family load manageable could also help move a heavy harvest over snow. This is where winter transportation and winter food production meet. The sled does not merely carry dinner, it makes some dinners practical to bring home. The animals themselves also shape travel indirectly. Grand Portage interpretation notes that the local animal community has changed over time. Caribou once lived in northern Minnesota, while deer were less common there when deeper snow and a more boreal environment favored a different mix of species. Changes in land use and winters have since made the area better suited to white-tailed deer. That matters because winter hunting was never one frozen tradition aimed at one permanent set of animals. The forest changed. Animal ranges changed. Trade changed what hunters wanted. Later logging and settlement changed habitat again. Families adapted because the resource map was moving even when the lakes and ridges stayed where they were. The fur trade added another pressure at Grand Portage. Ojibwe hunters and trappers exchanged furs for imported goods, including firearms, powder, cloth, blankets, and other items. The trade did not replace older subsistence work. It became layered onto seasonal economies that already depended on hunting, fishing, gathering, and stored food. Now, one animal might carry several kinds of value. It could mean food. Its hide or fur could become material or an exchange item. The trade value of certain pelts could pull labor toward trapping as well as hunting for the household. That created choices. Time spent checking traps was time not spent on another task. Traveling farther for valuable fur increased distance from camp. Imported tools might make some work easier, but ammunition, metal goods, and cloth tied families more closely to trading networks. Winter movement was no longer only about finding enough to eat. It could also be about meeting obligations created by exchange. And those obligations were not always harmless. Minnesota Historical Society accounts note that traders advanced guns, traps, and other goods on credit in the fall, expecting repayment after the season. As hunting became more difficult in some places during the 19th century, debt became one of the pressures used within the expanding colonial economy. That makes the quiet winter camp part of a much larger story. A person leaving before daylight to check a trapline might be doing household work, economic work, and colonial trade work at the same time. The snow around the lodge did not show those categories. It only showed tracks. Some led outward from people. Some came inward from animals. Some crossed once and vanished under fresh snow. And the family had to decide which ones mattered. That judgment could never be reduced to follow the tracks. The real question was whether following them would improve the household's position by nightfall. Sometimes the answer was no. A family still had stored food. The weather was worsening. A piece of equipment needed repair. Someone was tired or sick. The trail led too far. Choosing not to pursue an animal could preserve more energy than a difficult chase was likely to return. That is another place where popular survival stories often get the logic backward. They celebrate constant action. Winter households could benefit from restraint. Do not make a 10-mile problem out of a 2-day food supply. Do not burn tomorrow's strength because you saw one promising line in the snow. Wait when waiting is cheaper. Move when movement pays. And when hunting did succeed, the benefits traveled beyond the next meal. Food could be shared within the household. Hide could become useful material. Sinew and other parts could enter future making and repair. Fur could enter exchange. One animal could therefore support several different parts of winter life, provided the family had the labor and knowledge to process it. The hunt did not end when the animals stopped moving. It ended when its value had been turned into something the family could actually use. And once that work was done, the tracks outside the lodge were already changing again. Fresh snow could cover yesterday's decisions completely. By morning, the forest might look untouched. The family would still know better, and the children were part of that knowledge long before they were strong enough to do every job. A winter route could be taught without anyone standing in front of a map. A child learned it by moving through it. The shoreline appeared at a certain angle. A portage began near a particular bend. One patch of woods offered better shelter than another. A lake crossing felt different after heavy snow. The adults around them made choices, and those choices became lessons simply because the child was there to see the result. For Ojibwe families, this learning happened inside a seasonal life rather than in a separate survival course. Historical accounts describe winter groups that could be quite small, sometimes around a dozen people, before larger communities gathered again in spring. At Grand Portage, families moved from summer villages to inland winter hunting camps, and later toward maple sugar camps as the season changed. The same people moved through different kinds of work over the year. That meant children could grow up learning not one winter trick, but a sequence. First, how the household prepared. Then, how it travelled. Then, what happened when it stopped? A child might begin with very little responsibility, staying close, keeping clothing together, watching the sled, and following the packed trail instead of wandering into deep snow. Those expectations sound small, but small habits are how a person begins to understand the shape of a dangerous environment. Later, the work could expand. A growing child could carry something light. They could help gather small pieces of firewood. They could watch how snowshoes were put on and taken off. They could learn why the load was tied a certain way, why wet things were placed near heat, and why someone checked the weather before deciding to leave. We should be careful not to invent a fixed age chart or claim that every Ojibwe child performed the same task. Families differed, circumstances differed, and the surviving record is uneven. What we can say is that seasonal household work involved whole families, and oral history-based museum interpretation at Mille Lacs deliberately presents that life through the experiences and memories of Ojibwe people themselves. That matters because competence does not appear all at once. A child who eventually becomes good on snowshoes first has to become bad on snowshoes. The frames are wider than ordinary feet. The tail follows behind. Turning can feel awkward. Stepping backward is not the same as walking backward in shoes. Catch one snowshoe on the other, and the graceful winter traveller disappears very quickly. Adults already knew this because they had once learned too. So practice could happen close to camp, on short trips, or simply by following behind more experienced travellers. The packed line left by the people in front gave a beginner an easier surface than untouched snow. The child did not need to break the hardest trail, while still learning how to keep the frames from tangling. Even the snowshoe itself carried information about the country. The Hudson Museum notes that long narrow forms associated with Ojibwe and Cree traditions were one among several regional snowshoe designs, while an Ojibwe example preserved in the Ojibwe People's Dictionary shows a bent wooden frame, cross pieces, and rawhide webbing. These were not random shapes. Snowshoe forms developed around the problem of moving human weight over particular kinds of snow and terrain. A child did not need a lecture on pressure distribution to understand the result. Take the snowshoe off in deep powder. The leg sinks. Put it back on. The body rides higher. That is physics taught through an ankle. The same kind of learning happened with distance. Young travellers gradually discovered that a route that looked short across open ice could still demand hours of steady movement. They learned that a person who races at the beginning may be miserable before the end. They saw adults save food for later instead of eating everything when hungry. They watched camp work begin even when everyone was tired. Winter taught consequences very quickly. Forget an item, and you miss it. Leave something wet, and you meet it frozen or cold later. Pack badly, and the load shifts. Walk away from the broken trail, and each step suddenly costs more. These are memorable lessons because the landscape provides immediate feedback. Language added another layer: place names, names for tools, verbs for travelling, and terms connected with seasonal work kept practical distinctions alive. The Ojibwe People's Dictionary preserves separate vocabulary for snowshoes, snowshoe making, wearing them, travelling in them, and forms of damage to them. A child learning those words was not only learning labels, the language could separate actions and problems that mattered in daily life. There was also a lesson in pace that no object could teach by itself. Adults could see when a child was getting cold, stumbling more often, or falling behind. A short rest, a lighter load, or an earlier stop could preserve enough strength for the next stretch. Over time, the child learned to notice those signals too. Winter competence was partly knowing the land, but it was also knowing your own body before fatigue made the decision for you. That kind of judgment would matter later, when someone else depended on your pace. And then there were stories. Not every warning needs to arrive as a command. A remembered journey, an accident, a successful hunt, or an account attached to a particular place can carry practical information without sounding like instruction. We cannot safely reconstruct private family conversations from 2 centuries ago, but we do know that oral history remains central to how Ojibwe seasonal life has been recorded and presented at places such as the Mille Lacs Indian Museum. Knowledge could therefore arrive from several directions at once. Watch what an adult does. Hear what a place is called. Remember what happened there before. Try the task yourself. Get corrected. Try again. By adolescence or adulthood, the person who had once been carried could be carrying something else. The child who followed the pack trail could eventually break it. The person who once watched someone repair a snowshoe might later notice the first loose strand without being told. This is how a family transportation system reproduced itself without needing written instructions for every movement. The objects could be remade. The routes could be travelled again. But only if people learned what to do with them. And that learning mattered, because winter did not grade gently. A mistake during practice near camp might be funny or inconvenient. The same mistake 10 miles from shelter could become expensive. So children were not simply passengers waiting to become adults. They were future memory. Every winter journey gave them another piece of the map, another small job, another sense of how cold changes ordinary decisions. And eventually, on some later morning, the people in front would no longer have to tell them where the trail went. They would already know. And eventually, every winter traveller met the limit of planning. Weather could simply say no. A route that had been clear in the morning could disappear under blowing snow by afternoon. Wind could erase the packed trail. Visibility could shrink until the next shoreline, tree line, or rise in the land became difficult to read. Snow could thicken faster than a group could break through it. On exposed ice, even a familiar crossing could become a place where continuing stopped making sense. At that point, survival depended on a decision that modern stories often treat as failure. Stop! For a family moving through frozen country, stopping early could feel expensive. Food was being consumed whether the group moved or not. Firewood still had to be gathered. A delayed arrival might mean missing people or work waiting at the destination. Every extra night used supplies that had been packed for the journey. But pushing forward had costs too. A traveller who cannot see the route can drift off it. A sled can overturn in rough snow. Children can become cold while adults are focused on direction. A person breaking trail in heavy wind burns energy quickly. If the group reaches camp after everyone is exhausted, the hardest work of the evening still remains. So the question was not whether delay was costly. It was which cost was smaller. This is where all the earlier parts of the system suddenly became emergency equipment. The food stored months earlier bought time. The shelter knowledge bought protection. The firewood routine bought heat. The repaired snowshoes bought mobility for the next attempt. The clothing bought a margin against cold. And the family itself provided more hands than one traveller would have had alone. A storm did not create those advantages. Preparation had created them before the storm arrived. Imagine the group recognizing that the wind is getting worse. At first, the trail is still visible. Snow blows low across the surface. Then the edges soften. The person in front has to look harder for familiar features. Behind, the sled is pulling more heavily because fresh drifts are forming across the route. Someone could say that the destination is only a few more miles. That sentence is dangerous because distance is only one variable. How much daylight remains? How quickly is the snow filling the trail? Can everyone still work when the group stops? Is there shelter and fuel here that may not exist farther ahead? If the answer changes, the route changes with it. The safest move can be sideways. Leave the exposed surface, find trees, use the shape of the land, turn a travel stop into a camp. This is why knowledge of ordinary places mattered. It helped to know the possibilities between destinations, a protected bay, a stand of trees, an old campsite, a place where fuel could be found without wandering far. A route with remembered stopping places was more resilient. And once the decision to stop had been made, speed changed meaning. Now the goal was not miles of... It was reducing exposure before people became too cold to work efficiently. A shelter did not need to become a permanent winter lodge. The exact form depended on the people, materials, season, and situation. But the basic tasks were familiar. Get out of the worst wind, create a controlled sleeping space, establish heat, protect bedding, and keep the things needed through the night within reach. The family had practiced pieces of this many times before, people who knew how to unload the sled, where the fire tools were packed, and how to deal with wet footwear did not have to invent those routines in a storm. Routine becomes powerful when conditions stop being routine. Food became a different calculation too. If the group had expected to reach a destination that evening, stopping short meant eating from travel supplies for another night. That could encourage rationing. But rationing did not simply mean eating as little as possible. People still needed energy to stay warm, gather fuel, and move when weather improved. Eat too much, and the supplies disappear. Eat too little, and the body loses working strength. Again, winter punished simple answers. Fuel had the same problem. A huge fire could consume a pile of wood quickly. A useful fire had to last long enough to support the camp. If wind and snow made gathering difficult, every armful of wood represented time spent outside. Dry wood stored close to shelter became even more valuable because it reduced repeated trips into bad conditions. Then came waiting. Waiting is difficult to dramatize because very little appears to happen. But a forced stop still contained work. Bindings were checked. Snow was cleared. Food was prepared. Children were kept warm. Clothing was dried when possible. The condition of the weather was watched. The group listened for changes in wind and looked for changes in visibility. Most importantly, people preserved themselves for the moment travel became sensible again. This is very different from surrender. It is storing effort. A family that remained protected through the worst hours could leave with functioning equipment and rested bodies. A family that spent those same hours fighting blindly toward a destination might arrive depleted, damaged, or not arrive at all. And sometimes the correct answer was not to leave the next morning. One night of delay could become two. That was when stored food and known resources mattered most. The romantic version of winter travel assumes that every problem is solved by courage. The practical version recognizes that courage cannot manufacture calories, daylight, or safe ice. Sometimes the bravest decision is another day beside the fire. Traveling as a family also gave the group more information. One person might notice the wind shifting, another remember how the route behaved after a storm, and someone else see that a child was tiring faster than expected. They could still disagree, but the household had to live with the decision together. This is where authority and experience likely mattered in ways that the historical record does not always let us reconstruct precisely. We should not invent a universal chain of command for every Indigenous family. What we can see from the physical demands is that coordinated decisions were necessary. A group cannot safely split between keep going and make camp while sharing one sled, one route and dependent children. At some point, the family commits, then everyone works toward the same choice. If they stop properly. If they travel together. That principle may be more important than any single survival trick, because winter emergencies are often not created by one enormous mistake. They are created by several small decisions that keep moving in the wrong direction. Stay out a little longer. Ignore the wet foot. Skip the repair. Push past the sheltered campsite. Assume the wind will weaken. Eat into tomorrow's food. Each choice may seem manageable on its own. Together, they remove the margin that winter travelers depend on. The families who crossed frozen lands successfully did not possess some magical immunity to cold. They protected their margin. They left room for delay. They carried food that could outlast the expected day. They knew places where a route could be interrupted safely. They maintained equipment before it failed completely. And when weather erased the road in front of them, they did not need the road to reappear immediately. They knew how to wait. And when the storm finally loosened its grip, the family still did not simply pack up and rush forward. The first job was to find out what the night had changed. Snow could bury yesterday's trail. Wind could reshape drifts. A sled left ready beside the shelter might now need to be dug free. Clothing that had dried near the fire had to go back onto bodies that were warm now, but would cool quickly once movement began. The route itself had to be judged again, rather than assumed to be the same route that had disappeared the day before. That small reset tells us something larger about native winter travel. There was never one universal way to cross frozen land. Around Lake Superior, we have spent most of our time with Ojibwe families using snowshoes, runnerless toboggans, dogs in some settings, birch bark shelters, stored foods, and lake or forest routes. But move west toward the northern Great Plains and the equipment begins to change because the country changes. Trees thin out. Open grasslands stretch farther. Bison become central. And instead of one transport system surviving every environment, families use technology suited to the ground beneath them. For Blackfeet people of the northern plains, seasonal mobility was fundamental. National Park Service material from Glacier National Park describes a society built around highly movable lodges and the seasonal movements of bison herds. It also notes that winter camps had to be placed in sheltered river valleys, where the land offered more protection than the exposed plains above. That one choice could change an entire night. On open ground, wind has little to stop it. In a river valley, slopes, banks, and vegetation can break some of that force. A family did not need a modern wind speed reading to understand the difference. The body could feel it immediately. Shelter began with choosing the right landscape before the lodge was even raised. The lodge itself was designed for movement. Blackfeet skin lodges could be taken down, transported, and raised again as the camp shifted. That portability mattered because a household following seasonal resources could not afford to rebuild a heavy, permanent house every time the food map changed. Before horses became widespread on the northern plains, dogs helped move those camps. The technology was different from the flat toboggan we saw around Lake Superior. A dog travois used two long poles extending behind the animal, with a platform or load secured between them. The forward ends were attached near the dog, while the rear ends dragged across the ground. The National Park Service describes travois transport as part of plains life before horses made moving heavier loads much easier. The shape is almost the opposite of a sled. A toboggan places the load on a broad surface sliding over snow. A travois lets the ends of two poles drag while the load rides between them. Both solve the same basic problem. Human beings own more than they can comfortably carry, but each solution belongs to a different movement system. This is where the title of our story becomes more interesting. Native American families cannot be reduced to one picture of snowshoes and one kind of winter camp. The continent contains forests, plains, mountains, deserts, coasts, tundra, and river systems. Winter could mean deep powder in one homeland, open wind and hard ground in another, or mountain snow separated by lower valleys somewhere else. The useful technology had to match the place. In the Greater Yellowstone region, for example, the National Park Service describes the Tukadika, a group of Shoshone people, as remaining foot travelers with working dogs, even after many neighboring peoples adopted horses. Their dogs carried or pulled loads on travois, while the people hunted in steep alpine country where horseback travel was not always the obvious advantage it was on the plains. That is a valuable contradiction. More powerful transportation is not automatically better transportation. A horse can carry much more than a dog, but a horse also needs forage, space, and terrain it can negotiate. In rough mountain country, a smaller animal and a person on foot can still make sense. Technology is only advanced if it solves the problem you actually have. The Tukadika also made durable bowls from steatite or soapstone. Archaeologists have debated whether some of those heavy vessels were moved from place to place or cached and returned to season after season. Either possibility tells us something useful. If you carry a heavy object, it has to be worth the weight. If you cache it, you turn a known place into storage. That is the same transportation logic we saw earlier with food caches around the Great Lakes, but with a completely different object and landscape. You do not have to move everything every time. Sometimes the smartest load is the one already waiting for you. On the plains, portability shaped possessions in another way. Glacier National Park's historical overview notes that highly mobile Blackfeet life discouraged unnecessary heavy household objects. Materials that could become lodge covers, clothing, containers, bedding, or food had to justify the effort required to move them. Bison did that remarkably well. A single animal could provide meat as well as hide and other useful materials. Hide could become robes, lodge coverings, containers, or equipment. Dried meat could move with the camp more easily than fresh meat. The animal supported transportation even though it was the reason transportation was necessary in the first place. The herd moved. People moved. The camp had to remain movable because the food did. Then horses changed the scale. As horses spread through plain societies during the 18th century, families could move larger loads farther and faster. Horse travois replaced or supplemented dog transport in many places. Bigger lodges and more possessions became easier to move because the available pulling power had changed. But the horse did not invent mobility. It expanded a system that was already mobile. That difference matters. Before horses, people were not stranded in permanent villages waiting for better transportation to arrive. Dogs worked. People carried loads. Camps moved. Routes connected seasonal resources. Portable architecture already existed. The horse changed capacity, not the basic idea. And winter still imposed limits. A horse could carry more, but it also had to eat through the cold season. A larger camp could move more possessions, but more animals and people required more food and better wintering ground. Sheltered valleys mattered because winter was still winter, no matter how much pulling power stood outside the lodge. So the morning after a storm looked different in different homelands. Near Lake Superior, someone might be clearing snow from a toboggan and checking snowshoe bindings. On the northern plains, another family might be preparing a travois and watching the condition of animals before shifting camp. In mountain country, a dog might still be the practical partner for a route where a horse offered less advantage. The objects changed. The decision underneath them did not carry only what the land allows you to move. Use the animal that fits the route. Build a home that can leave when the food does. And never confuse one successful native technology with the only native way to survive winter. That is why the continent did not produce one winter survival system. It produced many, and each one was a map of the place that made it necessary. And that map was about to become harder to follow for reasons that had nothing to do with snow. For generations, winter movement around Lake Superior connected families to hunting grounds, fishing places, islands, relatives, and seasonal camps. Those routes did not begin as lines drawn by governments. They were lived geography, known because people travelled them, named them, harvested from them, and returned to them. National Park Service research describes the Grand Portage Ojibwe homeland as extending across lands and waters around Lake Superior and identifies Minong, or Isle Royale, as a core part of that traditional territory. Then new lines appeared. The United States-Canada boundary became one of them. Many close relatives of the Grand Portage Ojibwe live at Fort William First Nation near present-day Thunder Bay. The National Park Service notes that these related communities were separated politically when the international boundary was finally established in 1842. A line on a political map did not move the lake. It did not move the old trails. It did not erase kinship, but it could change the rules surrounding movement. That is one of the great differences between a storm and colonial expansion. A storm might close a route for a day. A border, treaty, reservation boundary, or new legal system could alter access to a homeland that people had already travelled through for generations. At Grand Portage, that shift was especially important because movement had always been central to the place. Geechee Oni Gaming, the Grand Portage, is an approximately 8.5-mile trail running from Lake Superior toward the Pigeon River. Indigenous travellers had used the route long before Europeans arrived, and European traders later adopted it as a critical connection between the upper Great Lakes and the interior. The trail was useful because it already solved a problem. Water could carry enormous loads by canoe. Rapids could not, so cargo came out. People carried it overland. Then everything went back into boats. That pattern, water, portage, water again, was not an inconvenience added to the route. It was the route. Winter changed the equipment but not the underlying logic. Frozen waterways could become travel surfaces. Snowshoes handled deep snow. Toboggans handled loads. Known land crossings linked one section of travel to another. Families who understood the geography could change technologies as the season changed. Colonial governments increasingly described that same country in another language. Jurisdictions, ceded territories, reservations, and international boundaries. In 1854, a treaty ceded most land associated with the Grand Portage Band to the United States and led to the establishment of the Grand Portage Indian Reservation. That did not mean Grand Portage people suddenly stopped having relationships with places beyond the new reservation boundaries. The older geography was larger than the new legal box. Minong is one of the clearest examples. The island lies far out in Lake Superior, separated from the Grand Portage mainland by open water during warmer seasons and under suitable winter conditions. Ice National Park Service documentation identifies Minong and the surrounding waters as part of the Grand Portage Band's ancestral land and records traditional activities there, including hunting, trapping, fishing, maple sugaring, plant gathering, and spiritual practice. Those connections are not merely historical. Grand Portage Band members continue to maintain relationships with Minong today, including fishing, gathering plants, and visiting for cultural and spiritual purposes. That prevents us from telling this story as though Indigenous winter travel belongs only to a vanished past. The technology's changed. Roads, engines, manufactured boots, modern insulated clothing, forecasts, and communication systems changed what winter movement could look like. But geography did not stop carrying meaning, because newer tools appeared. A route can outlive the technology once used on it. A place can remain important after the sled changes, and a family connection can survive a border that arrived later. Treaties created another complicated layer. In 1837, more than 1,000 Ojibwe met with United States representatives during negotiations for the Treaty of St. Peters. Minnesota Historical Society records that Ojibwe negotiators retained rights to hunt, fish, gather wild rice, and continue other uses of ceded lands. That mattered because seasonal travel was never movement for movement's sake. People travelled because something was at the other end. Fish, rice, game, maple sugar, relatives, a winter camp, a trapping area, A place remembered by the family. Restrict access to the place, and you alter the route. Restrict the route, and you alter the seasonal system built around it. Minnesota Historical Society summarizes the larger 19th century transformation starkly. The collapse of the fur trade economy, land dispossession through treaties, and the creation of reservations dramatically changed Ojibwe life and left communities with only a small portion of their original homelands by the end of the century. This is why the story of winter travel cannot end with a clever snowshoe. A snowshoe solves the physical problem of sinking into snow. It does not solve the political problem of losing control over the land beneath that snow. A toboggan can carry food. It cannot negotiate a treaty. A family can remember a trail. Memory alone cannot prevent another government from drawing a boundary across it. Yet memory still matters because it keeps the older geography visible. The National Park Service now describes Grand Portage National Monument explicitly as part of the homeland of the Grand Portage Anishinaabe, works closely with the band in interpretation and stewardship, and recognizes Minong as a place of continuing traditional importance. That is a very different picture from the old idea that Indigenous people simply vanished from these landscapes when the fur trade changed or reservations appeared. They did not vanish. Communities adapted under enormous pressure. Travel patterns changed. Economic systems changed. Some routes became harder to use. Some traditional uses continued through treaty rights. And relationships with places survived because people kept carrying knowledge forward. Think again about the child from our earlier journey. Someone teaches them a winter route. The snowshoe eventually wears out. The sled eventually disappears. Maybe the mode of travel changes completely. But that person can still know the name of the island. Still know why the family went there. Still know who lives across the boundary. Still understand that the place belongs to a story far older than the political line cutting through the map. That is another kind of survival. Not surviving one freezing night, surviving the transformation of the map itself. Because native families did more than learn how to cross frozen land. They carried knowledge of homeland through generations, even while governments kept redrawing its borders. And now, after 14 deliveries, the cold no longer looks like the main character in this story. The real story has been the system people built around it. And that system is where our journey ends. Not with one tool, not with one heroic crossing, and not with the idea that Native American families possessed some mysterious ability to ignore cold that would overwhelm everyone else. They survived because winter travel was organized before the first step was taken. Around Lake Superior, an Ojibwe family moving toward a winter camp could begin with food harvested and preserved months earlier. Snowshoes spread body weight across deep snow. Flexible moccasins worked with the bindings. A flat toboggan turned snow from an obstacle into a surface that could carry household weight. Dogs, where they were used, added pulling power. Familiar lakes, rivers, portages, and forest trails reduced uncertainty because the travelers were moving through homeland rather than through an empty white map. Then the family itself became part of the technology. Someone broke trail. Someone managed the load. Someone carried or watched a child. Someone noticed that a binding was wearing through. Someone remembered the safer campsite. Someone knew when the wind had changed enough to make another mile a bad bargain. No single task explained survival. The tasks supported one another. A well-packed sled saved energy. Saved energy made camp work easier. A good camp allowed clothing to dry. Dry clothing preserved body heat. Preserved heat improved sleep. Better sleep made judgment sharper the next morning. Good judgment kept the group from spending food and daylight on the wrong route. And if a storm stopped the journey entirely, preserved food and shelter knowledge bought the family time. That chain is much more important than any dramatic trick. Winter survival was often the art of preventing one small problem from becoming 5 larger ones. A loose seam was repaired before snow entered the moccasin. A snowshoe was checked before its webbing failed completely. Firewood was split before the lodge went dark. Food was stored before the season became scarce. A campsite was chosen before everyone became exhausted. The decision to stop was made before visibility disappeared. Most successful decisions probably looked almost boring while they were happening. That is why they worked. And the same logic appears when we leave the Great Lakes. On the northern plains, families dealing with open country, mobile bison herds, and strong winds developed different combinations of transport, shelter, animals, and seasonal movement. Dogs pulled travois before horses greatly expanded carrying capacity. Portable lodges moved with the people. Sheltered river valleys could matter in winter because the open plains gave the wind almost nothing to slow it down. In mountain country, another combination made sense. A technology that worked beautifully on flat snow might be awkward on steep ground. A larger animal that transformed travel on the plains could be less useful on a narrow or difficult route. People adjusted because there was never one universal Native American winter kit waiting to be copied from one nation to the next. The environment asked different questions. Communities developed different answers. That may be the most important correction of all. When we compress hundreds of indigenous nations into one image, we lose the very thing that made these systems effective. Specific knowledge, specific places, specific materials, specific relationships between people and the land they knew. A Great Lakes snowshoe is not impressive because it looks traditional in a museum. It is impressive because its shape solves a physical problem. A toboggan matters because it turns sliding friction into an advantage. A bark-covered lodge matters because portable materials can create a smaller, more manageable living space. A food cache matters because it allows the landscape to carry part of tomorrow's load. A place name matters because memory can be stored in language. A family matters because knowledge and labour can be shared. Put those pieces together, and the frozen landscape changes. The snow is still deep. The cold is still dangerous. The ice can still fail, but the family is no longer meeting those conditions as a collection of unprepared individuals. They are meeting them as a system, and systems create margin. Margin is the food left when the storm lasts another day. It is the dry pair of moccasins after the first pair becomes damp. It is the strength not spent racing across the first 5 miles. It is the knowledge that another campsite lies ahead. It is the choice to turn around while turning around is still easy. Modern survival culture often celebrates toughness because toughness is visible. You can film someone walking into a blizzard. You can measure a temperature. You can admire a giant fire. Preparation is harder to see. There is nothing spectacular about drying food in autumn so that someone can eat it in January. There is nothing spectacular about tightening a lashing before it breaks. There is nothing spectacular about taking a shorter day because a child is tired. But winter does not reward spectacle. It rewards systems that still work when people are tired. That is also why knowledge had to move between generations. A child travelling behind adults was seeing more than scenery. They were learning the shape of a route. They were learning the feel of snow under a snowshoe. They were learning which tasks happen immediately after camp is made. They were learning what adults look at before crossing ice. They were learning that stopping is sometimes smarter than continuing. Eventually, that child became one of the people making those decisions. The sled could be rebuilt. The snowshoe could be remade. The lodge covering could wear out. The most difficult thing to replace was the knowledge of how all the pieces fit together. Colonial borders, treaties, reservation systems, economic disruption and land loss placed enormous pressure on those relationships. Routes that had connected families and seasonal resources could become restricted or divided by new political boundaries. Yet the people did not disappear when the map changed. Communities remain. Languages remain. Relationships to homeland remain. Knowledge continues, even as the technologies used in daily life evolve. So if we return one last time to that frozen trail, the scene looks different now. At the beginning, perhaps you saw a family struggling through snow. Now look closer. The person in front is not simply walking. They are spending energy so everyone behind spends less. The sled is not simply luggage. It is stored food, bedding, tools, repair materials, and tomorrow's options moving over the snow. The child is not simply a passenger. They are watching the system they may one day have to understand. The older traveller is not simply moving more slowly. They may be carrying the deepest memory of the route. The fire waiting at the end of the day is not just warmth. It is a place to dry, repair, cook, teach, recover, and prepare to move again. And the frozen land is not simply hostile. It is a landscape with conditions. Some are dangerous. Some are useful. All of them have to be read. That is how Native American families survived winter travel across frozen land. Not by conquering winter, not by pretending it was harmless, and not by trusting luck. They survived by reducing waste, sharing labour, carrying the right things, remembering the right places, and knowing when the smartest movement was no movement at all. The lesson is quieter than the survival stories we usually tell, but it is much more powerful. The family did not have to defeat the winter. They only had to understand it well enough to make it home,